Welcome to Who's Point. What I want to address today is the remarks and statements made by the Foreign Secretary of England and also the Consul General of the United States government in Hong Kong in respect of the new electoral arrangements that has been enacted by means of the amendment to Annex 1 and Annex 2 of the Basic Law by the National People's Congress. Now, let's come straight to the point. What is the complaint? And what has it got to do? And what has it got to do with these countries? Well, let's start with Great Britain, because obviously because of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, they have what's called in law a locus standi, right? A legal leg to stand on to comment about a special administrative region of China, of the People's Republic of China. What is their right? Do we make comments about what happens in California, Minnesota of America? Why are they entitled to make these comments? And what do they know about Hong Kong? Well, let's start with Britain. Sino-British Joint Declaration. Well, first of all, it is not a treaty. The word says declaration, joint declaration, because there never was any valid treaty. The Joint Declaration is not the Treaty of Nanjing No. 2. Right? This is a seizure by force of sovereignty from China. We never lost sovereignty. We've never been able to exercise it because of the gunboat diplomacy after the Opium Wars. So a joint declaration is basically a diplomatic arrangement, a method by which a consensus was reached between the two governments, in which China made certain clear policy declarations of how it intends to govern Hong Kong after the resumption of the exercise of sovereignty on the 1st of July 1997, how it would govern Hong Kong, which is a part of China. Now, these basic policies are all clearly spelled out in Annex 1 to the Joint Declaration. And they're very clear, simple, and to the point. So, for a start, the first thing that says, the beginning of the Joint Declaration sets out these basic policies, and the first statement that was made under the body of the Joint Declaration is that the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region will be directly under the authority of the Central People's Government of the People's Republic of China. That's a very clear statement. Will be directly under the authority of the Central People's Government. So the sovereign authority over a territorial region of China is clearly spelled out in the Joint Declaration and later on in the Constitution for Hong Kong in the Basic Law. So that's very clear. And then it deals with, for example, how the chief executive is to be returned. Right? And it says in the fourth paragraph of Joint Declaration, the chief executive will be appointed by the Central People's Government on the basis of the results of elections or consultations to be held locally. So the chief executive will be produced by one of two means, either by way of elections, and those of you who understand the political science of the word elections means elections generally as opposed to universal suffrage, which has a very special meaning, which is one man, one vote, and very important, all votes are equal. Now, let's start with this first. America, as we have seen recently in the elections between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden that ultimately produced President Biden, is not based on universal suffrage. Right? If the system was based on universal suffrage, it would never have been Mr. Trump being president in the last term. It would be Mrs. Clinton, because she had 3 million more votes, if not more than that. if every vote is equal. It is produced by means of an electoral college, completely dominated by two political parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Nobody else can run for the President of the United States. You get no vote. In 1976, a man called Ross Perot ran for the US presidency. He is a very rich entrepreneur, spent lots of money, and he had 10% of the national vote, millions of votes, but he had zero in the electoral college. So please understand what you're talking about with democracy, right? The state of Alaska, which has a very small proportion of people, right, compared to the state of California, which have tens of millions of people, have the same amount of senators in the United States, because every state is sovereign, and by means of this union, the federal government evolves. So you have to understand the origins of each place's history and constitutional development to respect that country and the rule of law in that country and the constitution of that country. So here it says very clearly, the chief executive can be produced either on the basis of elections, which could be by means of electoral college. Any sort of election is election. Okay? Whether it's village elections, company elections, indirect elections, direct elections, but not universal suffrage. Very different. And more importantly, it doesn't even have to hold an election. Consultations to be held locally. Just consult. How does America know? How does the US State Department know about the state of affairs in Hong Kong, about the actual situation in Hong Kong, which is a phrase in the Basic Law, the actual situation in Hong Kong? How does it know? Do they care about Hong Kong? Have they spoken to a cross-section of people in Hong Kong? Do they care about the interests of 7 million people in Hong Kong when you start sanctioning our officials? When you put pressure, economic pressure, to bring down the edifice of Hong Kong, to not allow Hong Kong to say goods made in Hong Kong are made in Hong Kong, which is in clear breach of WTO. And Hong Kong is a founding member of WTO. We have our own identity in WTO. How dare you say we cannot say it's made in Hong Kong and tell a lie that it's another mainland city? How dare you? How do you care about the people of Hong Kong? It's a whole strategy of destruction. It fits their foreign policy. It suits their political narrative to target China, and Hong Kong is part of the ammunition, like Xinjiang, part of the ammunition to attack. And once you attack, you destroy Hong Kong. That's what they call collateral damage. Just destroy Hong Kong. Do they care? Do they come and speak to the people of Hong Kong? Do they? They only speak to those who say the words they want to hear, or worse, do their bidding. Let me ask you a question. If you reverse the situation, if during the riots last year, because of the protest about that Black Lives Matter, that black people were being killed by excessive police conduct in America, that they are being targeted. When that happened, and you have, for example, a senator from that state, from Minnesota, who thinks that the American government is suppressing the rights of black people in America. So he comes to Beijing during our 2 sessions, and he complains to the National People's Congress that the US government is suppressing the rights and freedoms of black people in America, and asks that there be sanctions by the Chinese government against the US government for suppressing these rights. When this senator goes back to America, do you think that nothing will happen to him? Do you not think that he has betrayed U.S. national interests, betrayed the U.S. Constitution, and has conducted in a treasonous behavior? Well, that's what this Hong Kong legislator did. Why are there double standards? Why? Why is it that America can have overseas jurisdiction against any country it decides to sanction? Because it equates power with right. Might is right. That's not the way. The arrangement in the Basic Law, which has nothing to do with the Joint Declaration, the Basic Law incorporates, when it was promulgated by the National People's Congress on the 4th of April 1990, after years of discussion with the people of Hong Kong in consultation, it incorporated all the basic policies of the Joint Declaration and more. More. Which are the two areas which it gave more? The first area was in national security legislation. It delegated to Hong Kong its responsibility, the central people's government's responsibility. In any country, it must be the central or federal government in charge of national security, not one part of the country. How can that be? Even in Canada, with two legal systems in two different cultures, there's only one national security legislation across the whole of Canada. Right? So in China, they allowed the Hong Kong government to enact national security legislation which are already existing in China. Every country has it. All 193 countries in the world have national security legislation, obviously, to protect the country's national security. Right? All the offenses are, by and large, of the same type: treason, betraying secrets, sedition, right? Succession, subversion. They're all there. In every country they have it. How it is enforced is the key point. And the whole idea of Article 23 of the Basic Law is not that it's up to Hong Kong to write a new charter of national security legislation, which is completely different to the rest of the country. How can that be right? Right? It will be the same national security legislation, right, as is already in the whole of China, but to be applied by the courts of Hong Kong under common law procedure and common law principles. For example, in this system, you can only arrest people when you have reasonable grounds for suspicion. Doesn't matter if it's national security, that's the procedure. And once you have reasonable suspicion, you will need to collect evidence to show that there's a charge that must be brought within 48 hours, that there's a prima facie case against this person. And then after a court of law in Hong Kong has found beyond reasonable doubt that he will be sentenced. And the sentencing tariff in Hong Kong is much milder than in other jurisdictions. No death penalty, for example. Really on a par with Anglo-American legal systems. And we have seen the courts functioning in the last 2 years with all the cases arising from the disturbances of 2019. There are convictions, there are acquittals. The courts are doing their job, applying the law of Hong Kong, which is given to Hong Kong by the National People's Congress through the Basic Law. We have a very good system in Hong Kong. And in the Basic Law, apart from the national security, and let me finish that part, which is that the reason why, very simple, why the NPC should pass a national security law last May is very simply because it has delegated the job of enacting a national security law in Hong Kong to the Hong Kong government, but it cannot delegate the responsibility. The responsibility is central people's government's responsibility to the whole country, that Hong Kong is not unsafe to national security of China. And when you have disturbances to the extent of 2019, when they're actually asking for not just the overthrow of the Hong Kong government, but the central government as well, when they start destroying the flag of China, destroying the emblem of China, right outside the central government's offices in China, in Hong Kong, which is part of China, what do you expect any other government will do? What do you expect? You must enact. And let me remind you, it has only enacted those offenses, not all of them, that are needed to stop sexation, i.e. 國家分裂, to break up of the country, to stop subversion. But there are others, like treason, which has not yet been passed, which is still under Article 23. Let's remind everybody. Article 23 is still there. It's just that the actual situation dictates that stability be returned to Hong Kong under Hong Kong's legal system, which the American and British governments are keen to destroy. Right? It's an act of destruction. It's not an act of construction, let alone an act of dialogue with Hong Kong people, with Hong Kong government about what's happening in Hong Kong. Has that happened? The missions in Hong Kong, they are consulate generals, the British and the American ones, under the Vienna Convention on Consulate Generals. These are not embassies. They don't represent the country's official position. That happens only in the capital city, like Beijing, by the US Embassy or the British Embassy, if you have a statement that represents your country to be made, not your consular offices dotted all around the country. These are there to provide consular services, renewal of visas, application of tourist visas, business visas, renewal of passports, and the promotion of trade. Not to be politically interfering. How would you like the Chinese consulate in San Francisco meddling in the elections for US president in California? How would you expect that to happen? That cannot happen. But it happens in Hong Kong. The Consulate General of the United States employ people with an official name card that they are from the political desk. They're employed in Hong Kong on a political mission. And what is that mission? To serve the interests of America, which is what they are constitutionally bound to do. And the US interest at the moment is certainly adversarial to the interests of China, as all can see. Completely adversarial. No space for dialogue even. No space for diplomatic, decent dialogue. It's all about posturing. It's all about showing might. It's nothing about what is right. Why not have a dialogue with Hong Kong? Hong Kong is not North Korea. Hong Kong is an open society. You can have any TV media station to watch into Hong Kong. A lot of foreign people live in Hong Kong by the day. They know what's happening in Hong Kong. You don't need Senator Ted Cruz on a cowboy hat to come to Hong Kong 48 hours and showboat and say he's visited Hong Kong. Hong Kong's being suppressed. Of the 5 demands made by these radical activists in 2019, the 4 of them relates to the withdrawn extradition bill and the consequences of people involved in it. Nothing to do with the societal. It's only the 5th one that talks about universal suffrage, which has never been brought up since 2014 as a matter of local interest. The people are interested to start going on that route again. Because I remind everybody, on the 31st of August 2014, the National People's Congress decided that Hong Kong can have, if it wants it, universal suffrage. And I mean universal suffrage, that every vote is equal. This was rejected by the opposition legislators of LegCo. Why? Because they want civic nomination. What is that all about? We're talking about the right to vote. They're now talking about the right to be elected. Firstly, let me explain under the international covenant. We are not talking about freedoms now. We are talking about rights. Freedoms. Nobody has complained about freedoms in Hong Kong during these disturbances. What freedoms have you lost? Only subject, universal suffrage. Okay, that's a right and privilege. Well, universal suffrage, does America have it? Does England have it? Can you have a right to vote for your Prime Minister? You only have one vote in England for the Member of Parliament. You have no vote for the Chief Executive of England, the Prime Minister. What are you talking about? And in 2014, that was given to Hong Kong. And the opposition whipped Hong Kong up in a hostility to say, no, unless we have civic nomination. In 193 countries under the United Nations, only 3 countries have civic nomination. And these are countries where the political structure is not so mature, that produces mainstream political parties, like in England, like in America, like in Canada, Australia, right? And only these parties produce, because they already represent the major political thought. Civic nomination is a complete red herring. Right? It's deliberately there to not want universal suffrage. So do you know what's happening in Hong Kong? Seriously, when you talk about universal suffrage. When we enact national security legislation, no, you can't have it. Why not? Oh, it's in breach of a treaty. Where does it say that in the Joint Declaration? That China relinquishes the right forever to enact national security in Hong Kong, which is part of China. When did it make that? Was it ever suggested by the British government? Don't be nonsensical. This is all nonsense. And for Western countries, enlightened countries, the leaders of the developed countries in the world, to come out with this sort of international narrative is a shame. I'm ashamed, because you really regard us as idiots with this sort of argument. You haven't even looked at the Joint Declaration.